James, really excited to have you on the show. Will you please let people know about your background, what you're doing today? I'm really excited about what we're going to talk about.
Thanks for having me, David. I'm a cultural anthropologist turned a business strategist for early stage consumer brands. And if we want to get into it later, I can give you the 5-minute version of that convoluted story. I am the unlikely business consultant. I win the award. I created the award and I gave it to myself. I work with a variety of consumer packaged goods companies. CPG is the acronym that covers our $2 trillion sector. It's basically everything you buy at Target and the grocery store that you never think about too much until you discover one of my clients' products, which blows your mind. And those are the people I work with. They're generally premium price products. They're doing something particularly innovative, usually niche, and they're doing it really, really well. At least those are the folks that I enjoy working with the most. And I wrote a book for them and the people who want to become them. So
good. I like it. And talk about the book.
So the book came from it really was one of those lucky coincidences of being a consultant for big public companies, which has, its own pros and cons list. But in the process of doing some work at the prior firm that I was at, which was a boutique market research consultancy, we were able to do some work for Coke and Hershey's independently on helping them figure out how better to shop, essentially, amongst fast-growing early-stage food and beverage startups, right? And I think everybody listening has consumed one of these brands that's come out of nowhere in the last 15 years, like Kind Bars, Skinny Pop, Vita Coco, coconut water, Plum Baby, organic baby food. I could go on and on and on. In fact, in the intro in my book, there's actually a list of the brands that I will now describe. And the way I can describe them best is that these are brands that they seem to come out of nowhere because they rode a growth curve that is essentially exponential. And in the industry that I work in, and I've been consulting in for 20 years, that growth curve doesn't happen very much. And during my whole career, the only brands that, with the exception of one owned by Frito-Lay called Lay's Kettle Chips, which really isn't a separate brand. That's the only CPG brand that I know that's grown exponentially. All these exponential growth brands have been basically startups coming out of nowhere. And the vast majority were founded by people who had no clue what the CPG industry was when they started. Now, some were business people, some had some money, some had neither business background or money and still won. So what they did, what I did at my old firm was that I had a team who was hired to go and figure out how these big public companies could shop better for startups, so they could get a better ROI. Because what they were noticing by about 2010, 2012, they were noticing that a lot of the acquisitions by the big firms, a lot of them were actually tanking. Like they were not being integrated well at all. And there were some headline brands that were doing really well post-acquisition, but the net was, it's really quite bad. These guys are playing 5 to 7x EBITDA multiple, and then the business isn't growing much after they buy it. In fact, sometimes it's declining.
Wow, that's pretty scary. Now, your book is called Ramping Your Brand.
Yeah,
right.
So that ramp in the title comes right out of skateboarding, which my son, 12-year-old son, is really into, and that was partially the inspiration. Although I arrived at it independently. Then I was watching him at a skate park. I'm like, yes, this is it, because a quarter pipe, which is the first really doozy kind of thing that skateboarders get involved in, is doing a quarter pipe, going up that quarter pipe, and at least pausing at the top, and then when they get a little better, they pause, they kick flip, and they go back down it, right? But getting up that quarter pipe is like a major milestone as a beginning skateboarder. Many people give up skateboarding before they ever pull that off. They just say, forget this, I'm going to ride my bike. Because it's terrifying. once you hit that near vertical part, it really gets terrifying, and you have to learn how to balance, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, so the quarter pipe is the metaphor of the book, because the quarter pipe is actually mathematically a logarithmic curve. It's an exponential logarithmic growth curve. And it just happens to appear at a skate park and in other places in the world and in your environment. So the key is that the book is about a path to scale that utilizes exponential growth, not like 5 booster rockets of hydrogen, right? Which is just a very expensive, big company way to launch a product. And that's how they do it. They just fire it out with a ton of capital and a ton of resources. But when you don't have any money, when your idea of a cash balance for your startup is $250,000 in like 4 dudes or women, you don't have the ability to purchase rocket boosters, to follow the metaphor, right? So you've got to do something else. And exponential growth is the most feasible path to scale, because what we found is that the Kind Bars, the Chobanis, the Skinny Pops, that got from nothing to 100 million relatively quickly, but not instantly, they went on this exponential growth curve. And we did that by doing a mass random analysis of growth paths using machine learning and just basic stats and logarithm math. And then we were like, wow, all the people on this exponential path, they're all the brands we're reading about. It was like this really big scientific, whoa. About 3/4 of the brands that have gotten to 9 figures in my industry's consumer packaged goods did it on this quarter pipe skate ramp. And the advantage it gives you, David, is that you have the ability, you're building exponential growth off a very small base, maybe $500,000 in the first year, or even 200,000, right? And so you're doubling every year often with these brands. But if you were to stare at the P&L from way up and above, from the position of scale, like way up above in the 9 figures, you would not see any growth. You'd be like, there's nothing happening. Right?
Interesting.
And that's why they all sneak up on the incumbents, because the first 5 years, there's no scale. They're doubling off a small base, but there's no scale, because that's how logarithmic math works. Then what happens in the back half, right, when the skateboarder hits that freaking wall and gets terrified, then the doubling starts to create this massively visible entity. I mean, this is like viral replication, bacterial replication, fungal replication in the wild, in biology. It's the same principle. You don't notice in the beginning, and then it's there.
James, it strikes me. So you were looking at this from the company side, the acquiring side, and I often think of the software space where I come out of, where a Google or a Microsoft can buy something at a ridiculous price, but it works out because they can plug it into their model and then it just takes off. But you come from looking at it where these major corporations that are consumer packaged goods couldn't turn it that way as well. So you analyze it. So can you give me an example of one of these companies that did this exponential growth and maybe some of the key attributes that brought that about?
Yes. So the skate ramp brands I talk about in the book and sort of deconstruct have a couple major traits. I'll just talk about maybe 2 or 3. One of them is that they focus early on the end consumer and building what they call in my industry velocity, store velocity, which is simply just how quickly it sells off the shelf at retailers or your website if you're doing D2C. But the most brands in my industry have a large retail component. So velocity, that velocity of sales off the shelf is something that you can grow as an owner if you are willing to spend the extra time and a little extra cash out of the store doing aggressive sweat equity kind of marketing tactics that Kind Bar was famous for, and honestly that Cliff Bar had invented before Kind, right? Cliff still has a large field marketing budget. They have wrapped pickup trucks in all the major cities in the West Coast because during the summer season they're up there at the trailhead handing out samples, right? Or they're hosting and sponsoring events, right? So this whole phalanx of field marketing is one of the key tactics that these guys use in snacks and beverages. Because what they're doing is it allows them to quickly in a local area get in front of new consumers and new households, but get in front of just the right predisposed people, and that's the key. Because what they're selling isn't a mass market product. And Cliff protein bars were not a mass market product in the late 1990s. They really weren't. I mean, they were just a head scratcher to the average person. You know, so you had to go for a niche audience that was going to understand the attributes that you were selling that are distinctive, you know, that commanded that premium price. So it's all about finding these predisposed consumer groups. And that's a lot of out-of-store legwork. This is not mass advertising, right? Now, you can do some of it digitally now with social media to complement. So that's one. The other one is this velocity growth that I'm talking about. In other words, they don't just sign up at Target. They're able to grow the same store sales at Target for years, these brands. And that actually, for my industry, was the real aha. Because what you have to understand, listeners, is that in consumer packaged goods, when you get to like $1 billion, where all the major brands are that we buy live, $1 billion to $5 billion, those are the market leaders in most categories, their velocities don't change. Like they're selling the exact same amount, more or less, on a seasonal cycle potentially through the year. Like it's basically static. So when they look at their own math, they don't see brands that are selling more and more out of every store every year. They don't see data like that. So they don't understand the value of it. To them, it's like, I just want to hold my velocity is what they call it. I want to maintain the sales. It's all about making.
Okay, but James, so our audience is entrepreneurs. So, and I think your book looks really interesting. So what are the types of things that they need to be considering that they could do to achieve that velocity, kind of get up the ramp to make this exponential growth happen?
So the first thing is they've got to design a product that will command a fanatical following early on with some kind of predisposed consumer group, be it by lifestyle or occupation. Those are the two big ones. And that product design has to reframe the category that they're selling products in as outdated. I mean, this is the communications game that the package usually is doing. So, for example, rather than typical snacks like the mountain bikers used to bring on the trail in the 90s, Cliff Bar basically came in and said, no, you need a complete meal's worth of nutrition with a specific protein carb ratio. We designed it for you. It'll cause you to not bonk on your 7-hour ride. And it was extremely valuable to those people. And so they would literally become heavy users, buying cases and cases of it. And eventually people would discover it. They would talk about it with their friends and they would start selling it outward, right? So your ability to create a product that creates that kind of word of mouth is key. And the first third of my book is basically how to do that. And it's a particular form of design strategy that these brands have used. And sometimes they used it, honestly, unconsciously. So yeah. The point of my book is to say, look, this is what these guys did that is connecting with consumers. I know that because I did a lot of research with the end consumers in a past life. So I know how they're receiving these symbols. I'm like, ooh. But a lot of it is really reframing the category and saying, hey, my brand has got the better ingredients or the better attributes, the better functionality that you want. And you start with that group of fans and then you build it from there. And sometimes you can sequence groups of fans as you grow. One of the oldest examples actually that we all know of, but maybe not the history, is Gatorade, which basically did this. I don't think it grew exponentially because it took so long to scale. But that brand is from the early 60s, from the Florida Gators, football team, which was a college team. I can't remember which city, forgive me. But anyways, they invented this formula for their own. They sold it in an aluminum can, like a little tin. And then it slowly, it had developed a cult following in that part of Florida, but basically it didn't really go anywhere with the original owners. And what happened was that at some point in the early 80s, Pepsi got their hands on this thing. And then they started turning it into a ready-made drink. and getting it beyond athletes. But what they did was they got it through the NFL in the 1980s. And once they got it to the NFL, they had gone from a tiny group of fans to basically a group of specialized users who had a mass audience staring at them, which is pretty much the dream situation for a niche marketer, is that you found that niche who need the Gatorade, right? Because they're athletes doing something unusual and they need that electrolyte replenishment. But then you get it in front of a whole bunch of other people who, like, for example, me in the 80s as a road cyclist, you're like, yes, I should have a liter of that before I go on my 50-mile bike ride when it's 90.
Yeah, it's interesting though that so many entrepreneurs, they rush to market.
Oh, yeah.
And if I'm hearing you correctly, and you're obviously very analytical,
right?
These successful people are actually taking a step back, and they're really, whether they do it quickly or whether it takes them some time, they're really figuring out how they have this big value proposition.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, what they're doing intuitively, and I encourage founders to do it deliberately, is that they're small enough in the beginning so that even if they're doubling every year, it's not rapidly becoming a big business, dude. So and that gives them time to interact with their consumers because they're not becoming overwhelmed in operating like a $20 million company, which becomes it turns you into a very internal focused CEO pretty quickly when you get that big, into the 8 figures. But when you're smaller than that, you can actually interact with your consumer. If you do the kind of techniques I talk about in the book, which are field marketing, out of store interactive techniques, not ideally suited to the pandemic world we're in, but they will return. Yes. And they work really well because they put the founder in front of the fan and they start learning. They start learning why they like it. And it may not be what the founder thought. Right. And I find this really common amongst nutritional innovations in food. There's a huge disconnect between what the founder thinks is the whole point of their thing versus what those early fans are. And if you are one of these arrogant founders who's like, oh, I know I'm the great innovator, and so I just want to flush this into the market and raise a whole bunch of money and do it, you may find that you basically don't even understand what you have. And there have been brands, I'm not going to name them here, that have face planted because of that arrogance, because they didn't realize, my very strange, idiosyncratic view of what I created has nothing to do with why it's taking off. Yeah. So the guys who do well are at least patient enough to say, this may not be finished, what I have. Like the product may not even be finished, or I may not understand why what I have, therefore I shouldn't invest in a marketing campaign until I know that, right? So I talk in the book about running an experiment, and what I found is that people like Dan Lebetsky, who ran Kind, these were highly analytical, experimental-oriented people, and they were patient, and patient enough. They all wanted to scale, but they were willing to spend 5 to 10 years to do it. And that is the difference between the guys who tend to ride this ramp and succeed, and I don't want to call it an ocean, but a steady stream of hasty. Here, I got a great story for you. I know you like stories. So I had this is a blinded discussion. I had a snack company that I worked with a couple of years ago, and the founder was new to CPG. He'd raised some money. I mean, not unnatural sums, but more than the average person. And so he had the ability to pay boutique salaries. So he got a bunch of people from the food industry and paid them ridiculous salaries, like near corporate salaries, to attract them, right? And he was thinking, well, they know their business function so much better than that I just buy that talent, bring it in. So, right. And he did. And I was literally in a session, and at lunch in the session, and it was not going well from my perspective because I wasn't gelling with his team, because they were all big public firm refugees, and they don't believe almost anything that's in this book. They actually believe the opposite. So it was getting really awkward. And by lunch, I was like, God, I would love to find a way to become ill and leave. So just like, I don't even want the second invoice. This was just a bad sale.
Yeah.
The founder, though, seemed like a good fit, but his team was a disaster.
Yeah. And
at lunch, one of them literally turned to me and was like, James, I get this exponential growth thing. I get that's more likely. It's the more likely path to scale. I get that, but we don't have time for Now, I'm introverted, David, so I'm not quick on my feet. Maybe I appear quick on this, but you're letting me do all the talking, so this is easy for me. I'm not quick on my feet, so I'm alone with him trying to, don't irritate your client is number one rule of consulting.
Yeah.
So, like, unnecessarily. So I didn't want to like just light into the guy.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I shut down the East Coast attitude, and I was like, well, that's your choice, man. That's your choice. You can avoid the data science and all the math, which, by the way, your boss paid to have applied here. I literally, at that point, I symbolically threw up my hands and I just coasted through the rest of the day because I'm like, I don't want to wait. You don't want to wait for reality? I mean, I don't even know what that means.
So did you did you ultimately tell the boss, or did the engagement just end and then, later on
I did tell them. I basically, I went to the bathroom after that, and I'm like, I knew I was going to have to bring this up, and I decided I was just going to do it right then because they were taking an extended lunch break privately, like back to their respective offices, which by the way that's for all of you who are experienced in managing and leading, that's a really bad sign of internal culture.
They're not hanging out together. They all went to their corners.
They're not a startup. That's not how a startup functions. Startup culture, you practically go to the bathroom together. Okay. So that if you don't have that level of intimacy, and which is one reason why I have to say, there's a bit of a tangent, why you will see a lot of successful sibling teams because they've seen everything. They've seen each other naked. They've done everything together. If they can get along, they usually can get along and deal with a lot of garbage.
Yeah, I'll skip the naked part, but getting along with the rest of the stuff sounds fine.
Yeah, I mean, but these guys were like this. I felt like I had walked into Kraft Foods.
Okay.
And so I did. I went to his office. And I'm like, dude, you got to stop hiring these people. These people wouldn't know how to work past 5 o'clock. If you put a gun to their head.
Yeah.
And they're what they're doing is using you. This is what I told them. You're using you. They're using you as a line on their resume for their next job, which they were waiting to try to find. They just took this job because you were crazy enough to give it to them.
Very astute, very astute. So
he didn't want to hear that. He didn't want to hear that, but it's just like,
yeah. So what did he do?
Oh, he fired them all like 6 months later.
Yeah,
it took a while for him to get it.
Months.
Yeah, well, he had to feel the pain some more. But he made the right decision. And then he brought in people who were from the startup world. Yeah. And they didn't require 6-figure salaries. They were excited by building something, and you could give them 5% equity or even 1%. Yeah. And they were like, yeah, because they're smart enough to realize that, well, if we do this, if we're a team, 1%, I could be a millionaire.
Yeah.
So it's just.
So you got this first third of your book that's talking about really defining the value prop much better, much more wisely, connecting with the fanatic. Sounds fantastic. Where does somebody go from there?
So once you've done that, you've got to manage an experiment. And this is where, you have to stop creating. You have to stop guessing. And you have to start doing a version of applied social science, which is what I talk about in the second part of my book. And it's managing this experiment where you use just the right key performance indicators for an early stage consumer brand. And I've talked about a few of them already, so I won't go over it. But the one I didn't talk about was repeat purchase, right? So you don't want your Instagram follower page to just be filled with people who, I don't know, like your posts. You need it filled with people who consume your brand on a regular, ritualized basis and have for months, if not years, right? So you need repeat purchasing fans in a consumer business because they create an efficiency to the business at a local geographic level for store distribution that you just can't replace the value of that. So for example, if you have, most people don't realize this, but your average consumer brand, even Lay's potato chips, it has this planetary nucleus of heavy users who produce more than 50% of all the annual revenue for that franchise. And then there's this ocean of people who sort of dibble dabble, and some people who just like randomly have it once a year. So
makes perfect sense.
Their sales machine is designed to capture all the weirdos who just have it one, just be everywhere. So you get all those one-timers, like once a year people. But their marketing team is focused on who? The geeks, right? They want to keep that case level. I mean, if you watch people who like really eat Lay's potato chips, I've been in these homes. I mean, they'll have a closet full of this stuff. They'll have the multi-pack.
That's kind of scary.
They'll have the multi-pack bags. They'll have like 5 family bags because they're going through, they eat like half a family bag at a time, right? During a football game. So they are pounding the chips, right? And they produce a massive amount of revenue. Now, when you're an early stage brand, that heavy user has even more value, because if you can just create, I literally put the math in the book. If you just create 10%, if you can convert 5 to 10% of your people to heavy usage, and what I mean by that is daily consumption or weekly, depending on the category. Yeah. You will create that explosive velocity growth, and your retail buyer will literally go, whoa. Because what happens with a lot of my clients, especially in food and beverage, David, is they end up creating a specialty food brand. And it only gets purchased for a treat. It only gets purchased for a party. And that's like the death knell in my sector. That's how an early stage brand gets to like 5 million and then just hits a wall. Yeah. So you have to have a team and a marketing machine and an outreach and a branding experience and everything that convinces people, oh, no, I need to have this every day. And then you start moving stuff. But that heavy user base means you don't have to actually convert a lot of households, David, to suddenly create a lot of money in even one major US city. So if you go into the data, you can create $5 million brands in one city.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense.
Yeah, but most people don't do it. They don't do it. They try to create they try to create $5 million over the whole country.
Yeah, and I'm also translating what you're saying, thinking of our stuff. Like we have Dave's Charm School that teaches soft skills courses.
Oh, right.
And really, the people that get the most out of it are the ones that are in it the most. We have people that use it where they use it as part of their onboarding process when they hire somebody, boom. Or we have, people that use it when somebody's put on a performance improvement plan. Oh, you need some soft skills work. But the real people that get the most out of it is like a team of people, might be 5 to 30 people. And they're like, every week we're going in and we're doing a lesson, or 2 lessons. And we're going to talk about, okay, what was in this lesson, anything we can apply. And week after week, they're using it, although I don't get paid per usage, but it's a similar thing, that engagement.
Yeah.
And then the other thing that maybe is one of your next thoughts, because I know you've got this connected, I just haven't heard you say it yet, and maybe I missed it, is that those fanatics then talk it up.
Yeah, they're much more likely to generate word of mouth. Now, it's going to be a minority of those fanatics who have the storytelling capabilities as humans to really get people jazzed, but they'll generally be there. I talk about in the book, who the optimal people are, and they're your repeat purchasers who actually, from the outside, they kind of seem stupid. I don't mean to be snobby, but they're not necessarily the most knowledgeable about even what you're doing.
Yeah.
But they do buy you repeatedly. But what they are is just gifted raconteurs. And that's one of the reasons why, like I think of a relative I have who lives in Santa Monica, and she's just perfect. She's a saleswoman, so she's just perfect. She can talk anything up. I mean, she get you excited about almost anything, a pile of rocks, right? And those are the people that, and generally good storytellers, and they can put that passion into the conversation, the unnecessary passion,
and they're not stupid. I know you don't mean that literally,
no.
But what they are is they're like a trivia person where they know lots about, they know a little about a lot of things. Right. Okay. Versus you. Right. A ton, 30 stories deep on whatever you're an expert at, but that's not their deal.
No, they don't have the academic mind. That's not their thing, but they're super valuable for talking up your brand, and I have told clients, like, these people are going to be in your early consumer base. So you've got to get out there and you got to have events and meet them, or create an email list, interact with them, and then literally go hunt for them, go hunt for this profile. And I tell people to hire those people.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because you only need 1 or 2 of them. And the odds are that they will be the highly valuable ones will be on the younger side. So they may be available, right? They may totally want to do this.
Yeah.
Rather than doing the classic thing, which is let me go call a job recruiter. And that's how you wind up with the guy who wants 180 grand or more and wants to quit at 5 and be on his cell phone all day as opposed to do work.
Yeah. Yeah. And the young people today, I mean, Gen Y, Gen Z, whatever you want to call them as we go down the ladder, they get a lot of bad talk about them, not willing to work, entitlement, whatever. But my experience is they're really just looking for meaning. They're looking for something they can believe in.
Yeah, they have a higher need for meaning and purpose early on in their career. I think you and I'm more of a transitional, but I think the baby boomers were willing to put up with a lot of soulless years at the office before they finally said I'm done. At least that seems to be the pattern. And I think they probably wish they all done it earlier. So they agree with their children, the millennials. But there's no shortage of work ethic in the younger generations. I've seen no evidence for that. But to get the work ethic activated, you've got to put together a different package. It's like, you can't be the narcissistic leader from hell and get. Well,
that's right. And what you brought up in the first third of your book, if you really define that value prop, that's going to connect with your fanatics. It's also going to connect with the type of people I teach hiring. It's also going to connect with the type of people you want to join your team. Yeah, as you say.
And I think I do occasionally find myself. You'd appreciate this. I find myself doing a lot of free HR consulting with my clients because I'm sort of like biting my tongue during the whole session, and I can't stop it. And then I just give it to them on a phone call for free, right? Because it's so important that they understand how to distinguish between people who have work ethic but are intrinsically motivated for that long-term goal versus people who have a transactional work ethic for a big salary, status, benefits package BS. Sorry. I mean, and it's the difference between a bureaucratic person and their motivational set and someone who's going to function well in a startup environment. And they're very different beasts. I've seen some people transition between the two worlds, but very few.
But I think what you're talking about in your book, this ramping your brand book, and what you do in your work is really critical, because if they take the time to really develop that value prop, then they're going to more fully engage with it, and then they'll be more willing to have the courage to protect it. Whereas a lot of the people, when you first join them, it's easier for them to keep that employee on board who they've seen yellow flags, red flags, this person's not a fit, but it's just easier to keep them than trying to find somebody else. And they take the easy way out. And
when I had that intervention with that guy, the snack guy, when I had that intervention at lunch, his immediate response was, I get it, but there's the people you're talking about are so hard to find. And my immediate response,
he's believing the lie.
Yeah. And then my immediate response and reply is, your priorities are messed up. if that's your answer, because your number one, the thing you should be spending all your time on is not staring at your damn spreadsheets, but networking, so that you become attractive to the right people. I see so many people in fast growing companies who actually lived this at a company, to be honest, fast growing companies that they weren't, they didn't have an automatic sniffer out there. They wouldn't put they didn't have resumes coming in all the time.
Yeah.
Constantly interviewing people, constantly in touch with the external market of human capital, right, as they say. And so they were just like, oh no, we need 3 account managers. Okay, put a job posting up. And what happens in a small business? You probably get this. What you wind up with? You wind up with people who just want to work locally, who are just looking for a transactional job with minimum commitment, yada, yada, yada. And these people just don't put their passion into that business.
That's right. So James, we're gonna like 5 minutes left or something like that, but I really want people to buy your book. What's the we've talked about half or more of the book, maybe not more than half, but what's a final? I'm going to be candid to our audience. What's a final hook you can give people here that you've got to read this book because I'm going to walk you through X, Y, Z to help you experience this exponential growth? What you've said already is worth the whole value of it. I mean, I buy the book just on that, but I know you've got more in the book. What do you want to give them a glimpse of or an example of that's going to convince them, oh, wow, I got to listen to this on Audible, or I got to buy a copy of the book?
I think regardless of the industry that you're in, you have a customer. And I think if you read this book with an open mind, you'll see the enormous power, how efficient your small business can be and how fast it can scale if you build the entire thing from your offering to the internal culture organization around a specific group of people who you truly, honestly want to serve and help. You know, this is, other people have talked about this, but this book is like a classic example of it in consumer packaged goods. When you do that, you generally wind up with a whole package, a whole system, a brand that's going to grow exponentially. It all starts with that customer focus.
And if I remember from the description of the book, you're kind of going to walk me through some steps, aren't you?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, we talk about designing to command a premium in the first part. We talk about managing a small experiment. That's where you get your lab coat on and you do this in a disciplined way and you learn from your consumers, you learn what's going on. Then there's optimizing what marketers call the conversion funnel. So you're trying to optimize a tactical set of moves that allow you to create those high value, heavy purchasers reliably as you move from city to city and from chain to chain. And then finally, there's the really geeky stuff on how you actually hit the gas and start accelerating. And those are techniques that are very specific to consumer packaged goods, but people might find them interesting anyways because they apply to the kinds of products you guys consume at home. So if you want to learn why it is that you suddenly are buying cases of something at Costco, the final part of the book will explain that to you. You have been played, my friends.
So, and a tipping point when people look at the book that's an indication, particularly because you're an introvert, is you have some very impressive entrepreneurial testimonials for the book. And if you were an extrovert, you could probably round those up very easily. But being an introvert, I think it speaks to the value of the book. So I do encourage people to check it out. How can people learn more about you, James? And it sounds like they can find Ramping Your Brand on Amazon and other booksellers. Am I right?
Yeah, you can type that title right in and you can read 74 reviews. I don't make this stuff up. I didn't pay them. So if you want real readers' opinions, go for that. Or you can go to www.rampingyourbrand.com if you need a little more of a sell. You can read more testimonials and get access to my email list too, if you're just dying for more email. I know.
Well, that sounds great. The bad side about this podcast is I'm going to go get your book and have another book on my shelf that I've got to read because this sounds really good for us too. But I really want to thank you for your time. You've been great. Any last thoughts or just a farewell to our audience?
My last thought is that I do have the book on sale right now for probably 1 to 2 days on Amazon. So, have a week purchase intent buy at a discount on me. So.
All right. Well, that's great. I will have them check that out. And thank you, James, for being with us.
Thank you very much.